Okay, Howie, the session is yours.
Hi, everybody. Good evening. Hope everyone is well. Good to see everyone out there. I should just say something I said in the first session is I'm hoping the next session I do will be not only on Zoom, but also in person. So I'm very much, I'm enjoying this. I think this is wonderful that we can do it, but, it's time to get back in person. I'm hoping we'll be able to do it. But for now, this evening, we're going to turn to our fourth and final session in our study of the Jewish press, and the event we're going to focus on this evening is the Abrahamic Courts. Now, I'm going to reiterate something I said last week. Last week when we spoke about Bernie Madoff, I made the disclaimer that typically historians don't like to speak about things that are very recent. And the rule of thumb is things that happen in one's own lifetime are too recent to think about historically. Well, this week we have an even bigger problem because Madoff at least was 10 years ago. The Abrahamic Chords is maybe 2 years ago. But with the Abrahamic Chords, in addition to the fact that it's very recent and we really don't have much historical perspective, we don't even really know what the outcome is going to be. On top of that, the Abrahamic Chords is also a very partisan issue, which makes it even more complicated to talk about in a reasonable, balanced sort of way. And when I say partisan, I mean it was put into place by an Israeli prime minister who was either extremely popular in Israel or extremely unpopular. The country was very divided about him, and the meetings between Bibi and the Arab states that signed the agreements that participated in the accords were mediated by an American president who also was either very popular or very unpopular. So this isn't only a very recent issue, it's also a very partisan issue. And so what we're going to try to do is we're going to try to look beyond all of that to see what can we say thus far about the Abrahamic Chords, and also we want to understand, remember, how these events have resonated through the Jewish world as seen through the Jewish press. So I think the best way to start is we have, thankfully, one of the ways we can get past the recentness and the partisanness of the Abrahamic Chords is we have another event which gives us some nice perspective, some comparative perspective. So I want to echo back what we spoke about 2 weeks ago when we spoke about the Balfour Declaration. Because I think the Balfour Declaration and the Abrahamic Chords, these are very similar moments. Very similar moments. So what did we say about the Balfour Declaration? I will just reiterate, or if you weren't here, I'll just sort of lay it out for you. The two main points we made is, first of all, the Balfour Declaration initially was greeted with just overpowering euphoria and excitement. There was a sense among many Jews that this commitment by Great Britain to create a Jewish state in Palestine was the first step toward an imminent creation of a Jewish state in Palestine. That was 1917. In retrospect, we know that it was not. We know that all of that enthusiasm, no matter how well-intended it was, and obviously without the benefit of hindsight, we're not going to criticize it because they didn't have the benefit of our hindsight. But in retrospect, we can say it was all premature. It was all misplaced. There was, based on what we now know, that 30 years later, the British still, not only had they not created a state, they were the main impediment to the creation of the state. We now know that all of that euphoria about the Balfour Declaration was premature and misplaced. And the second thing we noted when we spoke about the Balfour Declaration is why it turned out that way. And this is the other point we're going to look at. The other sort of axis of analysis we'll use this week is the reason the Balfour Declaration didn't work out the way everyone hoped was because of British self-interest. British self-interest, it was their own self-interest, which is why they gave the Balfour Declaration, they issued it in the first place, and it was their own self-interest, which is why they basically reneged on it. So we can use those two lessons from the Balfour Declaration and apply them to the Abrahamic Chords, and they'll give us some semblance of understanding of the impact and the importance. But again, I want to reiterate from the outset, this is a disclaimer with a capital D, or disclaimer in all caps, bold-faced, italicized, underlined, is that The Abrahamic Chords just happened, and there is no way to know what the upshot, what the impact of the Abrahamic Chords is going to be. And anyone who pretends to know what it is either full of it or a politician or both. That no one can possibly know. And things that are too recent, how could anyone know? Ditto the Iran deal. Ditto anything that happened in the last 5 years. It takes time for us to understand the real meaning of these kinds of events. Okay, so with all that in mind, let's turn to see what we've got. Now, first, to make sure our terms are clear, when we talk about the Abrahamic Chords, we're using the Abrahamic Chords as a kind of shorthand for the Abrahamic Chords themselves, but also two arrangements that accompanied the Abrahamic Chords. So there's a declaration known as the Abrahamic Chord, which we'll take a look at in a second. But there are also agreements reached between the State of Israel and the United Arab Emirates, and an agreement reached between Israel and Bahrain, and the beginnings of an agreement with the State of Israel and Morocco. So we'll take a look at those in a minute. But the first thing we have to make clear is, what did the Middle East look like on the eve of the Abrahamic Chords? And more importantly, how had the landscape of the Middle East, and especially the landscape of Israel's relationship with its neighbors in the Middle East, how had that changed during the years, I would say the 2 decades leading up to the Abrahamic Chords? So what can we say happened right before are these important events leading up to? First of all, there is the Oslo Peace Accords, and then the failure and the collapse of the Oslo Peace Accords. Remember, in the 90s, there was an attempt, probably the most concerted attempt by the State of Israel to make peace with the Palestinians. It ultimately was upended. That's a whole separate story. What we're now understanding in retrospect is that that really was upended by 2 things, mainly the lack of strong leadership on the Palestinian side and the premature death of strong leadership on the Israeli side. The assassination of Yitzhak Rabin, the illness of Ariel Sharon, and the absence of strong leadership thereafter. That's really where it went off the rails. So the first is the failure of that peace accord. Secondly, there's a realignment, not just in Israel's relationship with its neighbors, but in Israel's neighbors' relationships to each other. This we could go back all the way to 1980, the war between Iran and Iraq, which until that point, there at least was the perception that the entire Middle East and the entire Muslim and Arab worlds were united against the State of Israel, and the war between Iran and Iraq, which really had nothing to do with Israel, belied that myth. And since then, there have been various conflicts between Muslim states in the Middle East and in North Africa and in the Muslim world. That sense of unity disappeared. It was further that myth was further laid bare by the Iraqi invasion of Kuwait and by a coalition against Iraq. In other words, the Arab countries that were once thought to be allied firmly against Israel and all agreeing on that, it turns out their relationship to Israel and the conflict between Israel and the Palestinians was not the top issue on the agenda for many of these countries. One of the things we have learned in the last 20 years is, let's take the strongest country in the region other than Israel, Saudi Arabia, the strongest economically. Their primary concern is not Israel and the Palestinians. Their primary concern is Iran and Iranian expansion. So to really understand the dynamics of the region regarding Israel and otherwise, the first thing we have to unglue ourselves from, and it's not always easy, is we have to unglue ourselves from the idea that everything in that region revolves around Israel and attitudes towards Israel and political negotiations, international relations in the region revolves around the Israel-Palestinian conflict. It doesn't. Now, for Israel, it does, because that's obviously a pressing conflict. For Jordan, it does, because Jordan is right there. And for Lebanon, too. Maybe Egypt. But for all the rest of the countries, including the Emirates, including Bahrain, including Morocco and Saudi Arabia, there are other issues. And finally, the other thing is the emergence of Iran as a kind of military threat in the region, not only to Israel, but especially to Saudi Arabia. That's really the big conflict in the region, not Israel and the Palestinians. Now, I know some of you might be saying, how am I belittling or dismissing the conflict between Israel and the Palestinians? I'm not. It is an important conflict, and it's a difficult conflict. And from Israel's vantage point, it's the central conflict, the most difficult and threatening conflict, even more than the conflict with Iran. But the Middle East in general, there are bigger fish to fry, so to speak. And that's not even to mention the relationship between Turkey and Iran and Egypt, who form a sort of non-Arab triangle in the Muslim Middle East to the Arab countries. There are much larger geopolitical issues. And if we want to understand the Abrahamic Chords and the relationship between Israel and these other countries, we have to understand the fact that it's, there was no big surprise that it didn't involve that suddenly the Palestinians were left out, because there are bigger issues, especially the coalition against Iran. Now, building the coalition against Iran was really something that it began several presidencies ago, during the Clinton administration, during George W. Bush and the Obama administration, lining up Arab allies against Iran was well underway long before the Abrahamic Chords came into being. The other thing we have to understand is this, that officially, prior to the Abrahamic Chords, Israel did not have relations with the Emirates and these countries, Bahrain, officially, but unofficially, everything stated in the Abrahamic Chords, except for public symbols like an embassy, all of it had been happening for at least 20 years, if not longer. I can say personally, we all have a friend like this. I have a friend who used to be maybe in the intelligence business. I don't know. He never said for sure. Let's say he never denied it, but he never confirmed it. And he would tell me every now and then, or call me with these little arcane pieces of information. Like, and this was like maybe in the 90s or maybe the late 80s. He'd say, "Hey, guess what? The Iranian foreign minister, this was in the 90s, the Iranian foreign minister just arrived in Tel Aviv or Jerusalem to negotiate some kind of oil deal." Not in the papers. There's a lot taking place between these countries, which simply is not made public. So the Abrahamic Chords did not create an alliance or a relationship or any kind of exchange out of nothing. Most of what the Accords did was to make public that which had been taking place under the surface for a long time. Okay, now with that in mind, let's take a look at what the Abrahamic Chords actually say. So let me share a screen here. Okay, pull this up. Okay, yeah. Just a minute. Share a screen. No, that's the wrong one. Hold on. Here we go. Over here. Let me get this out of the way. Where's this here? Okay, can everybody see it? Can you see the Abrahamic Chords here? Am I sharing? All right. So let's take a look at what the Abrahamic Chords say. So it says this, quote, "We, the undersigned are going to be the countries involved, recognize the importance of maintaining and strengthening peace in the Middle East and around the world based on mutual understanding and coexistence, as well as respect for human dignity and freedom, including religious freedom. We encourage efforts to promote interfaith and intercultural dialogue to advance a culture of peace among the three Abrahamic religions and all humanity. We believe that the best way to address challenges is through cooperation and dialogue, and that developing friendly relations among states advances the interests of lasting peace in the Middle East and around the world. We seek tolerance and respect for every person in order to make this world a place where all can enjoy a life of dignity and hope, no matter their race, faith, and ethnicity. We support science, art, medicine, and commerce, and humankind, maximize human potential. We seek to end radicalization and conflict, to provide all children with a better future. We pursue a vision of peace, security, prosperity in the Middle East and around the world. In this spirit, We warmly welcome and are encouraged by the progress already made in establishing diplomatic relations between Israel and its neighbors in the region under the principles of the Abrahamic Chords. We are encouraged by the ongoing effort to consolidate and expand such friendly relations based on shared interest and a shared commitment to a better future. Okay, that's lovely. And it feels
Howie,
good.
I think you've got the wrong screen that is shared. We're seeing your email right now.
Oh, well, that's not good. Hold on a second. Let me stop the share and then try sharing again. All right. I hope there was nothing. Here we go. Boom. Okay, that's better. I hope there was nothing incriminating there. All right, good. I'm just imagining what was on that screen right now. Okay. All right. The point I would make about this statement, it's very nice. It feels very good. It's very exciting, very uplifting. But what it does not have is any kind of teeth. This is where it really resembles the Balfour Declaration in that it doesn't really obligate anyone to do anything. Based on that paragraph, that is a joint statement of basically saying we want the world to be a better place, and we promise we're going to try to do that. Beyond that, there's no one is committing to anything there. So I don't want to belie the fact that it's a nice statement, but it doesn't really mean anything. So where something might mean something is in the actual statement itself, is in the actual accords, the agreements between Israel and the Emirates. Let me stop the share. Let me share this one instead. This one isn't on your sign up, I believe. This one is, yeah, here we go. Can everybody see this one? We good here? Let me see if I can move this over. Just a second. Computer's being, it's not letting me. Okay, here we go. So, it goes on for several pages, but I'm going to go straight to the point where it says, this is what Israel and the United Arab Emirates have agreed to do. Okay. Now, what I want to point out is, as a list, if this was ex nihilo, out of nothing, all of these things are remarkable. But I want to underline how much of this is actually new and how much of this is basically giving a public rubber stamp to something that had already taken place. Okay. The establishment of peace, diplomatic relations, and normalization. All right. Now, the ties between Israel and the UAE were partially normalized, so this makes it at least theoretically fully normalized. Good. Okay. Number 3, establishment of embassies. The parties shall exchange resident ambassadors as soon as practical after the signing of this treaty, shall conduct diplomatic and consular relations in accordance with the applicable rules of international law. That happened already. There's now a Israeli embassy in the Emirates, in Dubai, I believe, and there is the Emirates have an embassy in Israel. Now, I would point out here that embassy is not in Jerusalem, it is in Tel Aviv. Okay. Now, we remember that the moving of the embassy to Jerusalem was supposed to be this seismic deal. Here's an agreement which, well, puts a little asterisk next to it, but we'll come back to that. Okay, peace and stability. Number 4, the parties shall attach profound importance to mutual understanding, cooperation, and coordination between them in the spheres of peace and stability as a fundamental pillar of their relations, as a mean for enhancing those spheres in the Middle East as a whole. They undertake to take the necessary steps, yada, 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 yada. Okay? Here I would say this is much like the Abrahamic Court Declaration itself. This is a commitment to peace and stability, but does not outline in any way any specific commitment. Here are the contrast I would make. For example, the contrast between this and the Camp David Accord signed between Israel and Egypt, in which there was real commitments to do things, to make changes, to make sacrifices. This is a very nice statement. Doesn't mean a whole lot. Let's scroll down a little bit to number 6, mutual understanding and coexistence. The parties undertake to foster mutual understanding, respect, and coexistence, and a culture of peace between their societies in the spirit of their common ancestor, Abraham. This always reminds me, when you have one of those ecumenical interfaith dialogues, they're very nice. How much do they actually change in terms of people's attitudes? Who knows? Okay. Strategic agenda. The parties, this is number 7, the parties stand ready to join with the United States to develop and launch a strategic agenda for the Middle East, which is a code way of saying an alliance against Iran in order to expand regional diplomatic trade stability and other cooperation. They're committed to work together with the United States as appropriate in order to advance, blah, 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 blah. You can go through this agreement very closely. These are very nice statements. In this agreement, there is no firm commitment to do anything other than establish an embassy. Now, that's a big deal. I'm not saying that it's not. The embassy is important. I just don't want to overstate the importance of this agreement. And remember, our template here is the overstating of the importance of the Balfour Declaration. That's our frame of reference. Okay. All right. So that's what the agreement was. The one other thing I would add is here I'm going to say something that some of you might not like, but it has to be said. Okay. The fact of the matter is the accord was really the third. Well, it was the third diplomatic initiative, the third successful diplomatic initiative of an American presidential administration that had promised to resolve the conflict in the Middle East. To resolve the conflict in the Middle East. So when I say the third, there was recognizing the Golan Heights as Israeli territory, there was moving the embassy to Jerusalem, and there were the Abrahamic Courts. Now, one of the things that we've seen since the Accords were signed is the reemergence of the real conflict facing Israel, and that, of course, is the conflict with the Palestinians. This accord did and said nothing about the relationship between Israel and the Palestinian people and Palestinian aspirations for statehood, and all of those problems that completely ignored it. In this sense, when we look at these diplomatic initiatives from the last 5 years, from the Trump administration, the way I would characterize them is, yes, they were all successful initiatives, but I would call all three of them low-hanging fruit. Every president since Kennedy, or at least since Johnson, has promised to move the US Embassy in Israel from Tel Aviv to Jerusalem. Everyone promised to do it as the culmination of a peace agreement between Israel and the Palestinian people. Everyone would have moved it if the peace agreement had been reached. And in the 90s, it almost was moved when the Oslo Accords seemed to be working. President Clinton was probably the closest to moving it, but that peace arrangement never came into being. So effectively, by moving the embassy before the completion of the peace treaty, the parental analogy I would give would be giving a fussy child dessert before dinner. Why would that child possibly eat dinner when they've already gotten dessert? That is a parenting 101 mistake. We have tried very hard not to make it. I wish I could say we never did, although I think we were pretty good about it. But moving the embassy without the peace is basically saying, in this case to Bibi, you get what you want without having to take the difficult step. In other words, 4 years of the Trump administration, they grabbed for the low-hanging fruit. As we'll see, the Accords were also low-hanging fruit, and the difficult stuff was left dangling, and it's still festering. The hard problem was never addressed. And this obviously wasn't only the president, but the people he had working on it. One was Jared Kushner, and one was David Greenblatt. And with all due respect, the comedy duo of Kushner and Greenblatt, this is not Kissinger and Cyrus Vance. So anyone who expected these two to solve anything, come on, let's be serious. Okay. Now let's turn from the facts of the Abrahamic Accord and the background. Let's see how the Jewish press actually understood it. Okay. So let's go back to my screen here. Okay. Let me see. All right. So I'm going to go a little bit out of order here. All right. Let's go here. Let's take a look. Let me see what I want to do first. Yeah. Let's look at this one first. Well, we'll start with the first one. Okay. Let's start with text number 2. Okay. This was an essay published in the Jerusalem Post, an op-ed published in the Jerusalem Post in September of 2020, not long after the Accords were signed. All right. And this author is going to draw a direct connection between the Abrahamic Accords and the Camp David peace accords signed between Israel and Egypt. So this guy is doing what I suggest we should do. Let's use some past event that we do understand as a frame of reference to understand this. So this is what Herb Kanan writes in the Jerusalem Post. Now, the Jerusalem Post, in terms of a publication, tends to be in a more pro-Israel direction. It's been that way for a very long time. So this is a friendly essay. Okay, let's see what it says. We'll read a little bit of this. The Israel-Egypt, remember, making the contrast between 1979 and 2019 or 2020. The Israel-Egypt peace deal signed at the White House on March 26, 1979, spanned dozens of pages, included letters, annexes, detailed maps, and agreed minutes. So it goes when two sides that fought for four bloody wars decide to terminate their state of war and disentangle. There were no-go zones in the Sinai to delineate, timelines of withdrawal from oil fields to spell out, an international boundary to set. That takes a lot of ink. The same is true of the Israel-Jordan peace treaty signed on October 26, 1994 in the Arava. That's the desert between Israel and Jordan. That document, which put an end to the state of war that existed between two countries that have fought with each other 3 times, including a preamble, 30 articles, 5 annexes, agreed minutes. Contrast that with the relatively brief document signed Tuesday, meaning Tuesday in September of 2020 on the White House lawn. There were 3 documents in all: the Abrahamic Courts Declaration, Declaration of Peace, Cooperation, and Constructive Diplomatic Friendly Relations between the Kingdom of Bahrain, and the Peace Treaty with full normalization between the UAE and the State of Israel. The first document was 210 words, the second about 460 words, and the peace treaty with the UAE spread over 9 pages. Why so short? And here's the point that he's making. Because unlike the treaties with Egypt and Jordan that had to devolve into minute details about boundaries and timetables, these documents were much more general. Much ado was made in the run-up to Tuesday's signing that no one in Israel, outside of the prime minister, his advisors, and officials involved in drawing up the documents, had any idea what was in them. That the prime minister's office was so tight-lipped about the contents of documents fueled speculation that they contained something explosive. And here's the point: they didn't. The Abrahamic Chords Declaration reads like a John Lennon song. This declaration seems like a public service announcement declaring that those who had signed it had boarded a peace train, which actually isn't a John Lennon song, it's a Cat Stevens song, in the hopes that this announcement in itself will entice others to do the same. Now, the peace treaty with the UAE, however, is written in standard diplomatic style, dry and legalistic, not declaratory. Whereas the Egyptian-Israeli Accords included a letter from Menachem Begin and Anwar Sadat to President Jimmy Carter, committing themselves to negotiation toward Palestinian Authority in the West Bank and Gaza, negotiations that ultimately went nowhere, the Palestinian issue merited no more than 100 words in the Israel-UAE agreement. There is no mention there of a Palestinian state or Jerusalem or possible Israeli annexation, which is another way of saying this agreement did not deal with any difficult issues. There is no mention there. This is a treaty between Israel and the UAE, not between Israel and the Palestinians. If the devil is in the details, then one way to keep the devil at bay is simply not to get into the details. There is nothing in the documents regarding the Palestinians that could be used to break up the new relationships. That the Palestinian issue was barely mentioned demonstrates that pragmatism, because if one wants these agreements to last and bear fruit, it is common sense to leave out as many bones of contention as possible. So I would describe this little essay as cautiously optimistic about the Accords. The reason this relationship between Israel and the UAE is going to work is because they didn't reach any agreement on any of the big issues. Leaving Jerusalem and the Palestinians out, it's easy. Everything else is easy to agree on. In the same way that in the Camp David Accord between Israel and Egypt, the Palestinian issue remained unresolved, but the other parts of that agreement have lasted for decades. So that speaks well for this agreement. But the reason it speaks well, and the author here is also implying this, is that the participants in this agreement, they didn't even try to address anything difficult. So yes, it's an agreement, but it's a very shallow and relatively superficial agreement. They agreed on things that maybe didn't even need an agreement. Israel already had exchanges with the UAE. Now they're just more open. Okay, following up on that, along similar lines. Look at text number 3. This was an essay written by Meir Soloveichik. Now, Meir Soloveichik is one of the leading voices of modern Orthodoxy in America. He is the rabbi of the Spanish-Portuguese synagogue in New York. Politically, he stands to the right. He is a staunch supporter of former President Trump. He actually gave one of the prayers in the White House. I think he lit Hanukkah candles or something. So he is one of his great defenders, and I think still is, that I'm not sure. But this is his understanding of the Abrahamic Chords. Now, he is going to focus on one very specific aspect of it. And the question we have to ask as we read this is, how significant in the larger geopolitical scheme of things is this one specific aspect, keeping in mind this is an Orthodox rabbi writing this. Okay, quote, now this is text number 3. The premise of the Oslo Accords of 1993 had been that Israel had to take risks for peace, that only an Israel that was willing to make itself weaker could reach an agreement with the Palestinians, and that only peace with the Palestinians would allow for normalization with the Arab world. Now, the last part is correct. That assumption until the Abrahamic Accords was basically, you can't have peace with the Arab neighbors until you make peace with the Palestinians. But this notion of Israel having to make itself weaker to reach an agreement with the Palestinians, that is an opinion. That is a partisan view. Okay, but leaving that aside. Now, skipping down a little bit. Now, in a region terrified of Iran, it is not Israeli weakness, but strength that makes it so attractive. And an agreement with the Palestinians has been deemed unnecessary for normalization with other Arab countries. The achievement is not, okay, so he's saying basically the reason the agreement was signed is that the UAE doesn't care about the Palestinians anymore. Itself a problematic notion. And here again, we come to this notion of we don't know where this is going. We don't know if 2 or 3 years down the line, the UAE is suddenly going to discover or rediscover a connection to the Palestinian cause. Nobody knows where that's going. Okay, but here is the interesting thing that Soloveichik is going to add, the interesting added dimension of this lauding and celebration of this agreement. The achievement is not only political in nature. Right before the accord signings, the president's advisor and son-in-law, Jared Kushner, presented the king of Bahrain with a Torah scroll. Israel has a cold peace with Egypt and Jordan, but nowhere in these countries is Judaism flourishing. In contrast, the Abrahamic Chords were followed by shofar soundings and sukkahs in Dubai, and the crown prince of the UAE insisted that he hoped to see Passover programs filling hotels in the Emirates. In other words, what Soloveichik is saying, the Accords weren't just for good, they weren't only good for Jews and Israel and Israelis, they were good for Judaism. There's going to be more Judaism in Dubai. Now that's nice and all, but as far as improving political relations in the region, this is at best symbolic. Does it really, really matter if there's a sukkah in Dubai in terms of the larger stability in the region? I think that's magnifying something that's largely marginal and peripheral to this larger situation. Yes, the Camp David Accord did not lead to there being sukkahs and shofars in Cairo, but that was still a lasting peace agreement. So that's an added perspective, and that's an added complication to evaluating all of this, is sort of the Jewish or the religious part of it. And the people from Soloveichik's community, for them, they saw this as almost messianic in nature. Wow, Jews in Dubai are blowing the shofar. Great, wonderful. Okay. Now, I'm not belittling or dismissing it. I'm just saying that as a geopolitical accomplishment, okay, great, but really, I mean, there's a little bit of a so what under the surface. Okay. Let's go back to text number 1, and here's another early perspective. This one comes from the Jewish press, and this is an essay called The Abrahamic Chords Exposed. Okay, now this is a writer who takes a very different perspective. Like I said, responses, the initial responses to the Abrahamic Chords have been highly partisan in nature. And one of the things we have to do, one of the difficulties in understanding the significance, is sorting through the partisanship. So text number 1. Perhaps the most shocking aspect of the sham peace treaty with the UAE is that so many Jews have fallen for what amounts to a clever Arab ruse first popularized by the late Anwar Sadat. Now, this is someone who thinks that the peace treaty with Egypt for the last 40 years has been a sham, that this is all, what exactly this ruse is, I don't know, okay? Ironically, this accord is being celebrated by many who self-identify as right-wing, whereas many on the left, particularly many left-wing American Jews, are lambasting it. Anyone with common sense knows that they would be they would not be celebrating such a deal if it was brokered by Barack Obama. Okay, so now the Jewish press, this is a right-wing Jewish publication, but here is a right-winger who simply believes that the whole thing is he's reading it through the lens of some kind of suspicion of conspiracy. Okay, but so that part is okay. Yes, a little bit of a conspiracy nut here, but the last part I think is interesting, all right, because the part of the agreement with the UAE and the role of the United States in that agreement that sort of got swept under, that sort of not swept under the carpet, but just sort of glanced by without anyone really noticing or commenting, was that as part of the deal, in order to get the UAE to sign that treaty, the United States had to give F-35 fighter jets to the Emirates. Now, F-35, that's another way of saying the most advanced and sophisticated aircraft in the world. Now, prior to signing this accord, or prior to the commitment of giving the UAE F-35s, Israel had by far, unquestionably, Israel Air Force was unchallenged and unchallengeable because no Arab country had aircraft as sophisticated as Israel's F-15s and F-16s and the Levi and others, okay? But the Emirates with F-35s changes that balance. And here, this writer comments that with the promise of F-35s explicitly guaranteed. In other words, the agreement is enough of a sham, but the UAE is going to walk away with the most sophisticated fighter planes of anyone in the region. Israel's air superiority is going to be compromised. And in his mind, that's simply not a price not a price to pay. And this points to what I talked about, self-interest as a guiding principle. So where's the self-interest in the F-35s? From the vantage point of the United States, their main concern is not an agreement between the UAE and Israel. The real American self-interest is focused on making sure that the UAE is a loyal ally of the United States against Iran. And here's the reason why they gave them that they're promising the F-35s, that the UAE can be an effective and powerful ally against Iran. So American self-interest is compromising Israeli military superiority in order to build a more effective alliance against Iran. So you can't walk away saying Israel didn't lose anything. Israel didn't give up something. Israel's not taking a risk. Allowing the Emirates to have F-35s is a big risk. And let me make sure it's clear why. Today, the Emirates are an ally. If at some point down the road, the Emirates decide for whatever reason to change sides or to give those aircraft to someone else, like, I don't know, Iran, suddenly Israel will be facing sophisticated aircraft that they never have. That is definitely a risk, okay? Let me read the last three lines. Sadat's strategy lives on. Today, the smartest Arab nations follow Sadat's blueprint. Bahrain and the UAE are the latest to join the club. They have learned a valuable lesson. Say nice things that you truly do not mean and win valuable prizes from the US and Israel. Now, I know the cynicism of this essay is just profound. This is a very cynical essay, but it points to what I said about self-interest. Now, the other aspect of self-interest is not of American self-interest. And here, this one is more closely parallel to British self-interest. Remember, British self-interest in giving and reneging the Balfour Declaration had nothing to do with Israel or Jews or Zionism or anything. They were worried about India. They were worried about World War I. For former President Trump, self-interest in this case had to do with not winning this, not strengthening or fortifying Israel's situation, and not winning the support of American Jews. He's not trying to win the support of Mayor Soloveitchik. He's trying to win the support of Christian evangelicals. The Trump administration's main concern, not only in these accords, but also in moving the embassy and recognizing the Golan, is to win the support of Christian evangelicals. Now, if you want to do a little experiment, if you think I'm making that up, just, you know what you do, go to the archives of any newspaper and you'll see that the promise to move the embassy, the moving of the embassy, the recognizing of the Golan, they all coincided with moments where there was an uncertainty in a largely evangelical state. For example, the moving of the embassy to Jerusalem coincided with the election between the Senate election between Doug Jones and, wait, was he running against Judge Roy Moore? Yes, Trump wanted to, he did it to help win that election. Now, you're thinking I'm making that up. In case you think I'm just sort of imagining that, let's look at a couple of texts. Hear it from someone you trust more than me. If you're a Trump supporter, hear it from the president himself. Look at text number 4. This is an article from Times of Israel from August of 2020. Trump said he has moved U.S. embassy to Jerusalem for the evangelicals. U.S. President Donald Trump said Monday that his 2017 decision to move the U.S. embassy to Jerusalem and recognize the city as the capital of Israel was done for evangelical Christians. And this is them quoting him, and we moved the capital of Israel to Jerusalem, Trump said at a rally in Oshkosh, Wisconsin, that's for the evangelicals. He said it. So it's not me saying it, it's him saying it, okay? Similarly, look at text number 5. This is a little more elaborate. The United States recognized Jerusalem as Israel's capital to satisfy the evangelicals. U.S. President Donald Trump said Monday during the campaigns that we moved the capital of Israel. That's for the evangelicals. You know it is amazing. The evangelicals are more excited than the Jewish people, yada, 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 okay? The point being that this is an example of a diplomatic arrangement being driven by self-interest. And here is where we can reflect and learn, we can reflect and maybe take a word of caution from the Balfour Declaration. Because remember, when self-interest dictated the Balfour Declaration, the declaration happened. But as soon as that self-interest changed, the country, Great Britain, reneged on the Balfour Declaration. So the question we have to ask ourselves now is, at this point in time, American self-interest in the region dictates, because it's growing out of ensuring the point of evangelical Christians. Secondly, building a strong alliance against Iran. Could that self-interest, that self-interest is probably not going to change. Any Republican president who wants the vote of evangelical Christians knows that by winning the support of evangelicals, you automatically win 11 or 12 states, just hands down. That's how many evangelicals there are. And you also know that the alliance against Iran is all important. Now, what's the best way to make that alliance? That also leaves that nobody really knows yet. Was the Iran deal the best way, or was reneging on the Iran deal the best way? We don't know. Time will tell which of those decisions was best. So can we imagine a situation where American self-interest in the region will change? Or even more importantly, can we imagine a situation where evangelical self-interest in the region will change? Because if evangelical interest in the region changes, then the agenda of those who want to win the support of evangelical Christians will change with it. So why are evangelicals, why are they so excited about moving the embassy and the Abrahamic Chords and recognizing the Golan? Remember, the evangelicals, their love of Israel is not an end in and of itself. It is a means to bring the rapture. And in their mind, that strong Jewish state, or to be more specific, a Jewish state which governs all of the historic land of Israel, including the West Bank, including the Golan, and everywhere, basically recreating the kingdom of David and Solomon, that is a precondition for bringing the rapture. Now, remember, when the rapture happens, that's the point where Jews are given a choice between convert or die. So I have a little trouble with that evangelical belief, because they are, since I really have no plan on converting to Christianity that day, they are planning for the hasty arrival. They are praying for the hasty arrival of the day of my death. It makes me a little uncomfortable. I don't know. I don't know about you. In any case, could their interests in the region change? It's possible. I'll give you just a couple scenarios which are not even that far-fetched. The first is, the reason evangelicals are supportive of Israel is because of a theologian said that a strong Jewish state in the land of Israel is a precondition for the rapture. But another theologian could just as easily say that it isn't the existence of a strong state of Israel, but the destruction of a strong state of Israel that brings the rapture. That would bring a 180-degree turn. Okay. In the realm of not theology, I'll give you another scenario. If a group of evangelical Christian Palestinians living in the West Bank, if they went to their evangelical co-religionists in America and said, help us, it's not impossible that American evangelical sympathy might turn toward evangelical Palestinians in the West Bank. And the last possibility is something which actually did happen last year. There was a television station in Israel owned and controlled by evangelical Christians, which has been broadcasting proselytizing messages to Israelis. It's basically trying to convert Israeli Jews to become evangelical Christians. And the government shut it down. And there was a ripple in the evangelical community. Didn't get that much press. It was basically muted very quickly. But that is attention. All of these are possibilities. Now, are there probabilities? I certainly hope not. I wouldn't want any of those things to happen, because at this moment in time, just like Great Britain in 1917, the evangelical community is a great friend of Israel, but that could change. Now, what does that mean for how we understand the significance of the accord and the relationship with UAE? For the moment, this is a great thing. Israel has an additional, Israel can trade openly with the country. Israelis can go to the UAE, which is nice. Now, mind you, I would say that most Israelis are not going to do that. It's an expensive trip. That is a possibility. That's probably the top 5% of Israelis are going to be able to take advantage of. For most Israelis, it's just something nice to talk about or whatever. But there are also concerns. And that conflict has bubbled up again. It was largely ignored for 4 years. Now, does that mean they could have solved it if they had tried? Probably not. The previous administration, like I said, low-hanging fruit, Kushner and Greenblatt, they weren't resolving this sort of issue. I mean, Jared Kushner, Jared Kushner, he must have heard the soundbite that the conflict between Israel and the Palestinians is a real estate dispute. But I think instead of understanding it metaphorically, I think he took it literally. And some of the ways he tried to solve that real estate dispute is the same way he tried to solve his own real estate disputes, through extortion, bribery, coercion, gifts, whatever. And it went nowhere. But what we're seeing right now in 2021 is that conflict, you can't paper over or ignore that conflict simply by making agreements with other countries. The fact that there's now agreement with the UAE and with Bahrain changes nothing about that more immediate and pressing danger of the Palestinians. And that problem has actually gotten worse. But the biggest limitation, I would say, at this point about the Abrahamic Chords is, yes, an agreement with the UAE and with Bahrain is great. These agreements were supposed to lead to others. The bottom line is there's really only one country and one agreement that's going to matter in any significant way, and that's an agreement with the Saudis. If Saudi Arabia winds up making an agreement with the state of Israel in the spirit of the Abrahamic Chords and along the lines of the agreements with Bahrain and the UAE, that will be monumental and that will be seismic. If the Saudis are willing to say, we are willing to set aside our concern for the Palestinians to make a real agreement with Israel. Now that is something. But at this point, that has not happened, and it doesn't seem like it's going to happen. The Saudis really haven't changed their mind at all. They're continuing to build the alliance and to firm the alliance against Iran without ignoring the plight of the Palestinians. But that's really the one. Now, that's not low-hanging fruit. That's the beautiful melon at the top of the tree, to push the metaphor further. That would be the game changer. We haven't really seen the game changer yet. What we've seen is, let's call it a precursor, a possible precursor to the game changer. At this point, Israel's situation in the Middle East, in very real terms, is not that different than it was 5 years ago. In the summer of 2016, Israel was facing a threat from Iran, although the Iran deal had pushed Iranian nuclear capabilities into the future. That sort of breakout time is a little shorter now since the deal was reneged on. The Palestinian problem was there. It's still there. In 2016, Israel already had quiet, unofficial diplomatic relations with Bahrain and the UAE. Those are more open now. And yes, there are some symbolic changes, like sukkahs in Dubai, but nothing real has changed yet. Now, I would like to be more optimistic about the Abrahamic Accords. I'm by nature a cautious optimist, but as yet, to me, at this point in 2021, to me, the Abrahamic Accords are still closely parallel to the Balfour Declaration. So I'd like to feel like Jews and the Balfour Declaration in 1918, how excited they all were. But the trouble is, and the difference between us and the Jews in 1918 is, we have the benefit of hindsight and the perspective of the Balfour Declaration, the great reneging on an agreement for self-interest. And it's hard not to see that. It's hard not to see that very, very real possibility. But like I said, it may lead to something. It may not lead to something. Now, if a year from now, 5 years from now, we might see this all very differently. It could all get upended. It could all move forward. We don't really know. But what we do know is, and the lesson to be learned from the Balfour Declaration is learning from our own history. We don't want to leap too soon. We don't want to get too excited and thrilled before there's something excited to thrill about. And perhaps no less important, we have to keep in mind the limitations of that agreement. In other words, the Saudis are not yet part of it, and the UAE got sophisticated weapons. That is a very serious consideration with the possibilities for a very, very serious problem. So going forward, we can hope, we can look on the bright side. We can see Israel is certainly no worse off, except for the fighter planes, than they were before. But we also don't want to see that something monumental has happened, because neither the embassy moving, nor recognizing the Golan, nor the Abrahamic Chords is something monumental. Let's say a la the Camp David Accord. That was monumental. This might be monumental, but it's certainly not monumental yet. Thank you. Thank you very much. Let's take a look at the chat and let's see what we've got here. Let's see what kind of questions we've got. Okay. Let me just let that thunderous applause or jeers or whatever die down. Okay, let's see. Here we go. Here's a comment. The Abrahamic Courts could be part of a larger global move toward oligarchy, which possibly Israel is strategically seeing safer to align with the oligarchs than liberal democracies. As powerful Jews like Sheldon Adelson and Jared Kushner that supported President Trump through the Americans should move toward oligarchy. That's a very interesting point. And Israel has been making, Bibi made alliances with Orban in Hungary, and he improved, well, somewhat with Erdogan and with Putin. And yes, in the short term, that works well. The problem with allying with oligarchs is oligarchs can be very unreliable. They are self-interest to the absolute nth degree, and they can not only change their mind, they can change their mind on a dime. Putin can say one thing on one day, or Erdogan or Orban or other oligarchs, they can change their mind the next day. That is a very good short-term strategy. That is an unstable long-term strategy, as opposed to an agreement with, let's say, the agreement with Egypt. The agreement with Egypt was an agreement with a country that needed the arrangement as much as Israel did. The support of the United States, and I mean the bipartisan support of the United States, is much more firmly entrenched because it's much more difficult to upend. With everything that's happened and all the talk about Israel losing the support of one American party, the vast majority of Democrats still support the state of Israel. It's not unanimous like it was, but it's still 90%. It's still very, very high. Okay, so it's a very good point, but it comes with a risk. Okay. Bahrain was used as a U.S. military base in the 80s. Did this cause a rift between U.S. and Israel and U.S. relations? That's a good point. Thank you, Shelley or Harvey, or Shelley and Harvey. That's a good point. I don't think it caused really in the 80s. Israel didn't have the luxury of saying to the United States, partly because the United States was this much stronger ally. I can't believe you use as a military base. Israel basically said nothing. And the U.S., if anything, the U.S. using Bahrain as a military base strengthened the U.S. presence in the Middle East, which is always good for Israel. Okay. All right. In terms of the previous administration's initiative, let's not forget Jared's deal of the century that went into the dustbin. Exactly. Jared Kushner promised to solve the Israel-Palestinian conflict. I'm imagining the first day he landed on the ground there, he realized it was tough and we never heard about it again. Okay, and then just did this instead. Okay. Let's see. Last week, the environment minister. Yes, this new arrangement about the pipeline, because of the potential risk it poses to coral reefs. There's an environmental consideration in the Persian Gulf, which could throw a wrench into the agreement. Maybe. I don't see any of the parties involved. You know, Israel is a very environmentally conscious country. I don't see the UAE as one of the more environmentally conscious countries in the world. I don't think that's going to affect very much, mainly because the agreement didn't change very much. It's still going to be this exchange. Okay. But yes, it could raise the wisdom of the accord. It's a very good point. Okay. Okay, let's see. The Arab League proposal of 2003 offered full diplomatic recognition in Israel in exchange for a two-state agreement. The Saudis were the leader. Exactly. Successive Israeli governments refused to even acknowledge it. I would also add that Palestinian leadership, that even when they tepidly acknowledged it, they weren't nearly capable of bringing it to fruition, whether it was Arafat or his successor. Might Saudi Arabia be interested in bringing that proposal? That would be great. The Saudis are the ones who really push this peace process forward. Okay. Okay. Here's a question about the Jewish press covering the Ben and Jerry's decision. I'll come back to that. Let me do these other questions first, Alan, then we'll talk about that too. Okay. Regarding the oligarchies, the NSO scandal has highlighted how dictators around the world have used an Israeli company's spyware to target journalists. Excellent point. Dealing with oligarchs, in addition to the instability of the alliance, it also has there's a certain let's say ethical or moral issue. You're dealing with people who do things like, spy and kill journalists. It's tricky, and it's not an effective long-term strategy for a country that considers itself a democracy. Okay. New polling suggests there might be a generation gap among American evangelicals, with younger people not being on board with some of the hardline positions articulated by people like Hagee and Graham. Yes, within the evangelical community, there is a softening or their support for Israel is becoming less firm. The younger generation of evangelicals are starting to see the situation differently, and what the next generation of evangelicals is going to look like regarding Israel, we don't know. The same way that the previous generation, they were largely indifferent towards Israel. They didn't see the state of Israel as directly connected, or at least not as much as directly connected to the rapture. Okay, one last question here. A digression. Can I comment about the Jewish press coverage on the Ben and Jerry decision? Okay. If I was designing the series now, this would have been the last lecture, because this is a great example of a story which might wind up being something significant, but might wind up being just a footnote or a footnote to a footnote. And here's the thing. A company, well, two parts. First of all, Ben and Jerry's, they're a Vermont company. The founders are quite left-wing. They are progressive. First, it's important to note that they are not boycotting the state of Israel. They're only boycotting settlements. That is a big difference. That's the difference between them and the BDS movement. But the second thing, I think most importantly, more importantly is it really that significant that an ice cream company is boycotting, even if it was the state of Israel? There's a difference between a ice cream company boycotting Israel and a weapons company or an airplane building company or a significant industry. No offense to Ben and Jerry's. I have to also say, not selling to the settlements. If you live in one of the settlements and you want Ben and Jerry's, doesn't that mean you drive 15 minutes to Jerusalem and get Ben and Jerry's? I don't really see the significance, unless this is the tip of a spear that leads to a series of other companies doing the same thing. But I have to be honest, and again, no offense to Ben and Jerry's, I don't see Ben and Jerry's ice cream as a sort of pioneer or as a trailblazer in a massive wave of boycotts of Israel. I just don't see that particular company, and they're not pivotal. This is more of a symbolic gesture. The other thing about it is, and I think this is a cautionary note for certainly for anyone in Israel who is okay allowing the status quo with the Palestinians to persist. Yes, there is going to be more and more dissent and protest of the situation. So, if anything, the Ben and Jerry decision suggests the possibility that Israel, with its current policies, with its current status quo or relationship with the Palestinians, it's going to be more difficult to sustain. But Ben and Jerry's decision was a gesture. So what the state of Israel needs to do at this point is to make a gesture. You respond to a gesture with a gesture, and the gesture would be not dismantling all the settlements necessarily, although that would be very helpful. Certainly the political settlements, when they have a flag and a porta potty on a hilltop, but to dismantle one settlement. If the state of Israel right now confronted one group of angry settlers and dragged them away, I would say Ben and Jerry's might reverse their decision. They need to see some kind of gesture. Now, the timing is also very interesting, because Ben and Jerry's didn't do this when there was no hope of any change happening, but with a new Israeli government, for all the problems it's going to have, and being in the post-Bibi age, there is at the very least the possibility that something might change now. Now, I'm not saying probability. No one knows how likely it is, but it's interesting that Ben and Jerry's, in this, what might be a kind of opening or new possibility, they're putting their very small hat into this ring. Don't get me wrong, Ben and Jerry's is delicious. It's ice cream. It's not going to bring the economy to a halt. I would even say, if there was a boycott by the world weed industry, it would be more impactful. That's probably the way to change such things. But it's not nothing, but it's not yet sure. And so in terms of how the Jewish press has covered it, so far it's just repeating what's happened. I don't think anyone really understands the full weight of what this is, or even whether it's significant or not. So it's not nothing, but it's not quite clear yet how much of a something it is. That we'll know in the next few months, in the next few years, or maybe never. Okay. Let's see. I think that is all the questions. Are there any other questions? All right. Well, I hope you enjoyed the series. If you check, I'll be teaching a couple of series for JLearn, one in the fall, 2 in the fall, and one in February. And you can check with JLearn for that. And I'll also be doing a more series with Beth Am in the future. You can certainly find out about that. So I thank everyone for coming. Hope everyone will stay well, enjoy the summer, and I'll see you all soon. Take care, everybody.